A group of pro-Palestine activists have gathered outside the U.S. consulate here in Johannesburg. They want a permanent ceasefire out in Gaza, where over 30,000 people have been killed since the conflict began in October 7th last year. SABC News reporter Kailihle Khumalo is there and joins us now for an update. Kaya, a very good afternoon to you. Look, we had a similar march yesterday, just as, of course, those that are of the Muslim religion are about to mark the end of Ramadan. So do talk to us about what is happening currently there at this point. All right, it looks like we don't have Kaya available to us right now. So we're going to switch our attention to this now, where the former U.S. House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, and a key ally of Joe Biden has signed a letter together with almost 40 Congressional Democrats calling for a halt to weapons transfers to Israel. The letter urges the White House to conduct its own probe into an Israeli airstrike that killed 7 aid workers on Monday. It also says that the strike against the humanitarian convoy, along with the ever-worsening humanitarian crisis in Gaza, makes it unjustifiable to approve further weapons deliveries. And early this week, Israeli fighter jets launched missiles at the Iranian consulate in Damascus, killing several senior military officers there. Tehran has also vowed to retaliate. So for an update, let's talk to our correspondent, Alex Cadier, who's joining us from Tel Aviv. Alex, a very good afternoon to you once again. Look, large explosions reportedly seen and heard from the southern Israeli border. What are you hearing so far as the escalations are concerned today?
Well, certainly the real fear and the real sense in Israel and across the region is that there is a real risk of a serious escalation. We know that the war has been ongoing in the south, in Gaza, since the atrocities of October 7th, but there is a real concern that Hezbollah, which is backed by Iran, could really enter the fray in a very serious way after that airstrike widely attributed to Israel against a building adjacent to the Iranian consulate, which killed 7 Iranian military officers. Now, the real fear is also shown by the US and Israel. They say they are on high alert should Iran's retaliation come. They expect it will come before the end of the holy month of Ramadan, just a couple days away now. They say it will be a significant retaliation. We've heard from US intelligence sources speaking to CBS in the United States saying that could include a swarm of explosive drones targeting either Israel or US targets in the Middle East. So certainly a real profound concern here that things could get a lot worse before they get any better. That's why the Israeli military has cancelled any leave for soldiers who had some scheduled in the coming days. They've also called up more reservists and bolstered their air defenses as well, certainly in anticipation, in concern for that retaliation, which Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, says is definitely coming.
Now, Alex, there's also reports that the IDF has fired several senior military officials, as a report there has found that strike on aid workers was in serious violation of commands. What can you tell us in this regard?
Yeah, a series of mistakes. That's how the Israeli military commission that investigated the incidents says a breakdown in communication, the breach of protocol and the misidentification of targets all happened to lead to this tragedy with those aid workers dying, losing their lives, and the IDF firing 2 senior commanders and reprimanding others to make sure this does not happen again. But clearly there was a terrible, terrible mistake caused by the IDF, because these 3 cars were struck separately at separate times, and that's why Jose Andres, the head of the World Central Kitchen, the NGO, who's lost their members of staff, says he wants an independent commission investigating this strike. But clearly these strikes, these conditions, the humanitarian situation in Gaza continuing to put pressure on ceasefire talks, which we understand are ongoing in Cairo. The last tragedy, of course, to happen, we've heard from Israeli Defense Forces just in the last couple of hours. They have recovered the body of Alex Cadier. He was a 47-year-old Israeli hostage being held in Gaza. He was killed at the hands of Islamic Palestinian Jihad in captivity back in January, and we understand that a military operation by the Israeli forces have found his body buried in Khan Yunis in Gaza. So both for the humanitarian catastrophe on the ground and for those hostages still being held in atrocious conditions, time is really running out.
And maybe a little bit more on that, Alex. I mean, we did hear that a Hamas delegation headed by the group's deputy chief in Gaza, Khalil al-Hayya, will head to Cairo on the 7th of April for those ceasefire talks. I mean, what are some of the expectations, especially in light of what happened with the previous talks?
Well, I have to say so far the expectations remain reasonably low. There is an enormous amount of pressure on all sides to reach a deal, but not a huge amount of movement so far. What we do know is that very senior officials from both sides are going to be there. You've mentioned the fact that Hamas will be sending a delegation. The head of the Israeli security agency Shin Bet and the Israeli intelligence, the Mossad, Ronan Bar and David Barnea, will both be going to Cairo on Sunday, and that will also include the director of the CIA, Bill Burns, as well as Egyptian and Qatari officials. So very, very senior figures. We know the United States is putting pressure on Israel to give its negotiators enough room to maneuver to reach a deal, and asking Qatar and Egypt to do the same, putting pressure on Hamas to come to a deal. But the last proposals have basically been outright rejected by Hamas, who says that Israel is not trying to reach a deal. Israel, meanwhile, saying that Hamas's requests are delusional, so still a long way to go despite international pressure to reach a deal.
And I mean, Alex, back to that earlier point that you mentioned about the series of mistakes that have been made, of course, by Israel in Gaza. I mean, we're also hearing rumors that there are currently protests against Netanyahu in some cities in Israel. But interesting that in light of the UN's Council resolution, the US still will not condemn Israel, instead blames other countries who voted in favor of the weapons ban as being partisan to not calling out Hamas for its 7th October attack. I mean, a bit disingenuous, since the US did aid Israel with arms, as they have recently admitted that Israel might not have shown how they are actually minimizing civilian deaths in Gaza.
Well, certainly that is part of the growing international pressure. The United States not backing, you're right to say that, non-binding resolution by the UN Human Rights Council that has been very harshly criticized by Israel. But the United States is putting enormous pressure on Israel to deal with the humanitarian disaster in Gaza. We know that President Joe Biden, in his phone call with Prime Minister Netanyahu just a couple days ago, urged Israel to stop its military operations to allow for aid agencies to return to Gaza, because of course they are now much more concerned for their safety following that tragic incident where the Israeli Defense Forces killed those 7 aid workers. So there is pressure being placed on Israel by the United States, but clearly, the US continues to stand by Israel in its fight, as they describe it, against Hamas and against Islamic groups who have just, we've discovered, killed an Israeli hostage in captivity. So clearly, this situation is horrific, both for the people of Gaza, for the families of the hostages. And you're right to mention those protests are building up. Just this evening in Tel Aviv, there will be a protest at the IDF headquarters by the families of those hostages, who will then, on Sunday, travel to Jerusalem to protest outside of the Knesset, outside of the Israeli parliament. So there is a lot of domestic pressure, a lot of international pressure, and we've heard from videos on social media that now, for the first time since October 7th, a fuel truck and 2 trucks with medical supplies have traveled into Gaza through that northern Erez checkpoint, which the Israelis said they will reopen for aid. So maybe in the next few hours, maybe in the next couple of days, we could see some change, but at the moment, still a certain level of entrenchment in this horrible war.